I've got Andy Cole in the car with me. He's a client of mine, and we've done some business in the past, and just had lunch with him, and we decided we'd throw a video together for you guys about a couple of things. Andy's an engineer by education and profession. He also takes a special interest in the finance side of things, money management. What other things?
Just, I guess, a nerd across the board when it comes to personal finance, so including investing, financial planning, that kind of stuff.
Awesome. Yeah. Cool. So you were telling me about you just refinanced your house.
Yeah, last year. Yep.
So you bought in
2018. Yep.
And you've refinanced twice since then.
We have.
So tell us about that, maybe pros and cons.
Sure. So the first time, obviously got our initial mortgage back in 2018 when we first purchased the house towards the end of 2018. And at the time, we had PMI because we didn't quite put down 20%.
Right.
And then at some point in 2019, interest rates had fallen enough to where it made sense to go ahead and refinance again. It was, I think, they just about fallen a full point.
Okay.
I think one rule of thumb is, it's probably worth refinancing if you can save, a full percentage point.
Right.
It depends on the price of the house. I think the larger the cost of the house, maybe it makes sense even less than that.
Right.
Because it all comes down to, what's the cost of the refi, and from a dollar's perspective, and how many months will it take in savings to offset that cost, that additional cost. And whenever it gets to the point where that makes sense to do so, it makes sense to consider doing a refi. And so at some point, about after a year buying the house, it made sense to go ahead and do it. So we went forward. And this was, prior to COVID.
Right.
And then COVID happened. Rates dropped even further.
Even more.
To historical lows.
Down in the twos.
Right. Down into the twos. And I think we did a bit of the first time was just a pure refinance. We didn't do cash out or anything, and it got rid of PMI and got us a lower interest rate. And so we probably saved, $150 a month or so by doing that.
Wow. That's good.
Then on the second one, it had dropped to below 3, and we ended up, I think, getting up 299 on a 30-year. And we decided to, this is going to be the last time that we refinanced in maybe forever, because could interest rates drop any lower? Unlikely, just due to the Federal Reserve seemingly taking a hard stance that they weren't willing to go below 0.
Right.
And so if the Federal Reserve isn't willing to go below 0, then other interest rates, have some sort of lower limit or lower bound as well. And so because the Federal Reserve sets their interest rate, and all other interest rates pretty much float off of that. Right. And so the Fed fund rate, which is currently pegged at between 0 and 0.25 or 25 basis points, and the Fed resets that every 6 weeks. Okay. And so when COVID happened, and businesses needed help, needed lower financing rates, the Federal Reserve dropped things all the way to 0, which is kind of like what they did after 2008. They dropped it to 0, and they started to, in 2015 or so, they started to raise back up. Yeah. And it had gotten back up to around 2 prior to COVID. But then leading up to COVID, the economy was starting to falter a little bit, and they started to lower it, and then COVID happened. And then the economy, took a major downturn, and so they lowered it all the way back down to 0. Right. But then, like I said, all other interest rates and really all other assets kind of are affected by that. And so as the Fed fund rate lowers, so does the 5-year Treasury rate and the 10-year Treasury rate, and along with prime lending rates. Right. Okay, so when COVID happened, rates fell even further. Right. We decided we would refinance again, and since it was likely that it was going to be the last time in a long while that we had refinanced, because it was hard to see interest rates falling even further to make it, reasonable to do it again. And we're in our forever home. Like our my wife's folks live here. Like, we're not going anywhere.
Right.
And so, I wanted to lock in as low as I could get for, the next 30 years possibly. And also, while I was at it, whatever equity that was in the home, I wanted to tap into.
Right.
And so we went ahead and did a cash out refinance at that time, and just went ahead and pulled out the equity that we could, up to 20% on the value, so that we would just have the access to that. I mean, there's other ways to tap into home equity, but just at the time, it made sense to do so. And from an investing perspective, that's one tool you could use to get access to relatively, cheap capital or dollars to invest, is to do a cash out refi. But if you're, pulling money out of your home to invest, you're putting more risk on the table as well, because now you're basically applying leverage. But on the other hand, if you're looking to grow money over a 30-year period, borrowing at 3% and then investing it, it's not an unreasonable thing to do. Right? Like I said, you're taking on more risk, but if you can reasonably make a 3% or greater return over the 30-year period, then it should pay out in the end. But you have to be, I think what a lot of people fall victim to is they say, hey, this is a great idea. I'm going to pull out, 50 grand in equity from my home. And then they take that 50 grand and they go buy a car, or they go buy some other depreciating asset, or they go to, on some vacation, and they don't have the diligence or
they don't know the difference between an asset and a liability.
Exactly. Yeah. Which, if people haven't read Rich Dad Poor Dad, actually see it right there on Rich Dad Radio on your podcast player. My main takeaway from that book was understanding the difference between assets and liabilities, and what are you doing to grow your assets.
It's a must read. And
actually,
we'll put the link in the comments here.
I've actually done cash out refis twice. The first time I did it was when I lived in Nashville, and I did it after reading Rich Dad Poor Dad. And I said, okay, let's take a step back and look at all of the things in my life and classify them as assets or liabilities. Right. And so on the asset side, I had my 401k, my home, things like that. On the liability side, you have your vehicles, they're depreciating assets. Right. And what are you doing to limit your monthly expenses so that you can increase your monthly savings and grow your assets and limit your liabilities? And so at the time I said, well, my two main assets are my 401k and my home. And the 401k, it's like, well, there's not much different I can do there. I've got a pretty aggressive stance there, relatively young, so I'm more on the stock side than the bond side. And then with the home, there was, let's just say, $100,000 in equity. And that stood to, continue to appreciate at a certain rate, basically the rate of inflation. I guess home prices tend to inflate faster than the rate of inflation in some areas. But let's just say it, stood to grow at 2 or 3 or 4% per year. Right. In hindsight, it's grown a lot faster than that, just because of how crazy the market's been over the last several years. But how could you grow that? The asset side of that equation even faster, and so one way is doing the cash out refi. And so that's how I originally kind of went down the road of wanting to do that. But once again, like I said, you're taking on more risk. Sure. So you have to be fully aware of that and fully willing to accept that. And I know a lot of financial advisors, if people ask me, should I cash out refi? I don't necessarily recommend it. I think people should know it's an option. Yeah. But it definitely, adds risk and adds, the possibility that, you'll end up, your total net worth will end up being lower at some point than it is when you start the process. Right. Because you never know what kind of dips might occur. And if a 20%, 30%, 40% dip occurs in the market, and you have $50,000 or $100,000 more invested than you otherwise would have because of the cash out refi, well, now all of a sudden you've lost 30, 40, 50% of that as well.
Yep.
And so you have to have the intestinal fortitude to, stick with your plan. And that goes with all investing, not just, not just if you're looking to do some sort of cash out refi or, take on a more aggressive stance. Just any investing should be based in a solid plan of what you want to do,
right,
and a mix of investments that's aligned with your goals and your risk tolerance,
right,
so that when bad times happen, because they will, as evident by 2020, you can stick with it,
right.
And if you're adding more risk to the equation, then I'd say that applies even more so.
Yeah. What are you going to do with what you get from taking that risk?
Exactly.
Right? Hearing from people that don't have a vested interest in what they do. There's so much out there that people pitch online that they're selling something, or they would benefit from the advice that they're giving if people took it. And
right.
So it's sometimes just good to have a disinterested third party to hear from. But Andy, thanks for your time.
Yeah, well, thanks for lunch.
Man, I always enjoy seeing you. I'm Ben Nemec with Keller Williams Realty. Be sure to like and subscribe to my YouTube channel for more tips and information about Huntsville.